but that doesn't really explain the initial action. So this is something that's important. You see this as a subtle thing. It's a difference in temporal relation, because what I've noticed is that the functional representation of utility in neoclassical price theory, it seems to mix up the ex ante description of what will determine the action and what follows ex post. Because as Austrians, in a sense, when we have Austrian price theory, causal realist price theory, doesn't give, I was going to say something rude there, but it doesn't need to worry about utility afterwards to explain the price determination of the present. Okay, and you can follow the neoclassicals, and they contradict themselves in a nice way. Because from Varian's intermediate textbook, he describes a scenario whereby you have, so in the first chapter, you have people living on the outskirts of a city, and you have people living on the inner part of the city. And let's say you're living on the outskirts of the city. Then if the outskirts are B, so if you want to change to A, then of course the utility of A, if you're going to be a consistent, or try to be a consistent neoclassical, you're going to say, okay, it's going to be greater than or equal to the utility of B. But conversely, that action, if we're going to be consistent symmetrically, you could say that to stay in area B, which is on the outskirts, and not to go on the inside, the utility of A has to be less than or equal to B. But then, what you're saying is that one initial condition is causing two mutually contradictory outcomes. So this violates a basic law of logic, law of non-contradiction. You would be thrown out of class in any other discipline if you made this kind of argument. Okay. So let's look at this again. When you establish this so-called monotonic utility function, that should have been real space. For some reason it's disappeared. When you establish this, you're establishing a relation of representation. You're not establishing a relation of equivalence. Because if you were establishing a relation of equivalence, there would be some meaning to these mathematical operations, the partial derivatives. So we have to ask ourselves, what do these things mean? What could they even represent? And one paper I read, which was not published, but it's one of the working papers by Dan Mahoney, made this point. I think it's an excellent point. Okay. So again, the humor would come in better with this if I made animations. But if I press left, I'll go to the back a slide, won't it? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just come back to this for a second. This relation of marginal utility. Remember that with the Austrian approach to utility rankings are made in reference to all the other ends. And so that's also the case with marginal utility, because marginal utility is the ranking of the marginal end. If it changes, the things it replaces, they move down. And so every ranking and every change in ranking is made in reference to everything else. You don't have that when you cardinalize this concept. And actually, and this is why the next slide is relevant, you need to utilize this object of the marginal rate of substitution to gain some sense of reference between these two marginal utilities. Okay, and I called it Hicks's rabbit, because Hicks, admits it himself in Value and Capital. There's no real explanation given for why this marginal rate of substitution, the partial derivative of x2 by x1, if you're going to describe it in a two-bit model, why that thing is decreasing like that. I mean, I know that that describes a convex indifference curve, and you wouldn't get it if it was concave, but this theory really uses that a lot, and the tangency condition we saw earlier, it describes, once you have that tangency condition, that's the point at which the actor says to himself, okay, I've reached this point, and that's my optimum, that's why I've stopped. But this characteristic doesn't derive necessarily at all. You need to assume it. But the thing is, we can understand why this thing is useful, why it's needed to gain any kind of meaning from a mathematical approach to utility. And the reason for that is it allows you to make these referential comparisons. Because otherwise, this sole concept of marginal utility, this sole derivative, which I've put here, what's the meaning of it? It's not made in reference to anything else. If I ask you what the value of a good is, then you're going to say compared to what? So that's why I argue that actually the marginal utility which is talked about in neoclassical price theory is not the same marginal utility that's talked about in Austrian price theory. It's actually the closest substitute you could make to it is the MRS, the marginal rate of substitution. And again, these concepts are floating. What connection do they have to the actual action? And another thing that's interesting is that this much vaunted monotonic character of utility functions, I mean, what's the relevance of it? Because it follows simply as a consequence of the chain rule that this marginal rate of substitution, which allows you to gain the same demand functions by solving that Lagrangian, it's a consequence of the chain rule. So what do I care if I have a utility function u of x, right? I could transform that into a function that's diminishing. I could say e to the minus u of x, right? And again, it might seem nonsensical to you. Of course, it might make you feel bad that you don't have anymore an honest monotonic utility function, but the results are the same. It makes no difference to your actual results in this framework, whether you assume it to be monotonic or not. It could be negative. You could do whatever you want. So now that I've described that, I want to talk about another thing I mentioned in that paper, because I've already mentioned time in a certain sense. So let's think about time slightly more explicitly. I'm going to be a bit more nicer to neoclassical theorists here, because they do tend to acknowledge time preference as a factor in intertemporal choice, though they do describe it slightly differently. So, for neoclassicals, what you would tend to find is that, okay, so if you have some sort of utility, right, and you want to talk about the utility from a set of planned actions that go on, and I've made an infinite sum series here. I really don't care about realism at the moment, but it's just a description. So whereby delta is less than 1. So this is how you model your discount of future time, future gains from action compared to present gains from action. And some, not all neoclassical price theorists, but some of them make the argument that this is really something that's probabilistic. So it's kind of the idea that I'm going to value what I consume tomorrow a little bit less, because I'm not sure if I'll live till tomorrow. But that's really a separate consideration for the Austrians, because the issue of time preference is defined outside of both types of uncertainty, probabilistic uncertainty and nighttime uncertainty. Even in an evenly rotating economy, you still have time preference. And the argument for it is an elegant one, which I have tried to elaborate in a bit more detail here. Let's look at it. Consumption is the end of all production. That's the argument. So, what we can really visualize this in a bit more of a comprehensive way is, if we remember, actions have a period of provision to them. They have a period of production and they have a duration of serviceableness. And so that, you can say, is defined for every individual action. So now, I'm going to use a concept which I noticed Rothbard introduced in Mallick on States. He introduced this idea of general time horizon. And a general time horizon is something that an individual has with regard to possibly the rest of the actions that you conceive will be a couple more minutes.
Yeah, you've run out.
Oh, man. I covered far too much stuff in this paper. Okay. Let me think for a second. Okay, so, all right. So if you have an actor, let's say, who has a general time horizon, if you want to talk about, okay, are they going to make a decision, an investment project, which could yield them more berries, let's say, because it's Robinson Crusoe that we're talking about here. He could have a choice of investing the 10 hours to produce it, produced a stick which allows him to gain 50 berries an hour, or he could stick with 20 an hour. And this decision is made on time preference. But what determines this time preference? And this is where we find the general time horizon has some sort of analytic use, because it helps us understand this question. And notice that I have simplified this. You can't actually use this to explain anything beyond a one-good scenario. Because once you start comparing several goods, you run into something which is interestingly similar to the calculation problem, because you don't know people's individual preferences and you can't cardinalize the concept. But it helps us visualize the specific aspects of consumption now as opposed to later. Because the Austrians, when they're consistent, they avoid the pitfall of saying, of talking about saying that I tend to have a specific type of preference for something right now as opposed to later. Time preference is a general characteristic, and this helps you understand it. Because if you were in Crusoe's position, right, and let's say that you know you're in time, right, then, I mean, this is slightly assuming you're slightly numerate. I mean, you don't need to be numerate. All you need to know, all you need to figure is that going to be bigger than that? And if it is, then it's worth doing the project. If not, then why would I do it, right? So if you describe it mathematically, then if x is, if the general time horizon, if it's greater than 16 hours and 14 minutes, then it would be worth doing. So that's really a cutoff. That's when the investment project outweighs the benefits of just sticking and doing nothing. So that is how you can describe the scenario a little bit more generally. And I think it's useful because it helps us understand an aspect with regards to time preference. Because if you read some Austrian theorists, like Hopper, for example, he talks about how, and unfortunately for him, he got kicked out of the University in Las Vegas for this kind of argument, but it's sensible. If you have a project that requires a large period of time, then comparatively, you need to have a large time horizon for it. And similarly, if the benefits from the capital good employing it are comparatively small, then of course, yeah, you need to have a higher time horizon. And you notice that with individuals as they get older, perhaps possibly in their middle ages, because as they get really old, they enter what's called the second childhood, because they're anticipating the end of their days. But yeah, I mean, it gives you a perspective, and then it's not surprising that those types of individuals are the ones who are critical in terms of making capital investments in the economy. So yeah, so this thing is derived by understanding the time as an opportunity cost for gaining the capital good, as opposed to taking the consumption. So actually, this perspective that I've used to describe this scenario of capital accumulation helps you understand the. Okay, all right. Okay, so you can think about consumption in exactly the same way. And so the idea that leisure is a separate good is completely superfluous. And because leisure is simply the consumption of goods once they're produced. And hence the idea that you get in neoclassical price theory that you have a backward bending supply curve, and that leisure is some sort of strange homogeneous good is completely superfluous. And it's a neglect of this quantitative relation between means and ends. And I'm going to go quickly now. Okay, so neoclassical supply. Right, so, okay, they start off with the law of returns. You have average productivity being maximized, and you have the marginal productivity crossing at the maximum, right? That follows trivially. Okay, so then you have these things which are the inverse of that, the cost curves. The same relationship applies in the inverse because what you're taking is factor prices which are constant for the firm. Okay, and now you can get perfectly competitive price theory. Because, perfectly competitive equilibrium. I put Martian space on Edward Scissorhands because, you know, the whole Martian scissors thing. Okay. Right, so is this really a long-run situation? Because what is the key error that's made here in this description is that this thing is assumed to actually be an existent scenario. This is thought to be possible. But as we know, these guys are all sub-marginal sellers. Even though they're all charging the same price, they're all out of the market. This is not a model of equilibrium, this is a model of catastrophe. Because what will happen is that it'll go back to here, and each participant in this market is uncertain about any